Wilson and Nadel were even quoted to saying, "The Moon is always in view of two of NASA's primary tracking stations in Australia, Spain and California, but not so for the amateur. Some of the most exciting events and transmissions from the Apollo missions always seem to occur when the Moon is below the horizon for the continental United States amateur." Nevertheless, 5 lunar parking orbits and several hours of return trip transmissions were observed by this experimenter. Their article also carried this warning from the FCC. Important: FCC regulations prohibit disclosure of the content of communications not intended for the public. Thus, it is illegal to inform the press or any other third party of the content of information directly received from the Apollo communications link. How can radio hams be regarded as independent verification when the FCC restricts what little of their data they can and cannot release to the public? Not mentioning this in his video is another fallacy of omission by Phil Webb. Because it was NASA's radio telescopes tracking NASA's spacecraft, it was essentially the metaphoric equivalent to the fox guarding the henhouse.
The major flaw in this claim is the fact that Parkes was not owned or operated by NASA. It was owned by the Australian government. The Carnegie Corporation and Rockefeller Foundation together funded half the construction costs of the radio telescope, and the Australian government paid for the rest. Since it began operations in 1961, it has always been owned and operated by Australia's government body for scientific research, CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. Jera knows that.
Firstly, we in Australia pronounce it CSIRO, not Cicero. Secondly, the CSIRO has been involved with and funded by NASA since the early 1960s. On the CSIRO's website, we learn that CSIRO manages the Canberra Deep Space Communications Complex, one of 3 stations around the world used for communicating with NASA's spacecraft under contract to NASA. Since the early 1960s, NASA has also contracted CSIRO radio telescopes to augment its network of tracking stations for particular missions. The first such occasion occurred in 1962, when CSIRO's 64-metre Parkes New South Wales Australia telescope was used to receive signals from the Mariner 2 spacecraft. It was used again in 1965 to track Mariner 4. And further down below, more recently, NASA has contracted with CSIRO to use the Australian Telescope Compact Array near Narrabri, New South Wales for future space missions. NASA has contributed to changes to CSIRO's telescope that benefit both space tracking and astronomy. With so much contribution and contract funding coming their way of NASA, we can expect Parkes and the CSIRO to remain cooperative for some time yet. Thirdly, all of Parkes' operations during the Apollo missions were carried out under NASA's watchful eye. Who was in charge of operations at Parkes during the Apollo days? None other than NASA's very own Robert Taylor. It says so on Honeysuckle Creek's own website. Robert Taylor, from Goddard Space Flight Center, who led the NASA contingent at Parkes, controlled the releasing of data from Parkes to the network. Then if we go to Parkes' website, in October 1968, the director of Parkes Observatory, John Bolton, and his wife Letty, while on a trip to the USA, attended a dinner party at the home of Bob Lighton. Bob was a brilliant Caltech engineer who was a colleague of John's when John was a professor of astronomy at Caltech in the 1950s. Also present at the party was the head of the Goldstone project, Eb Richtin, of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. During the course of the evening, John was asked if he could make available the observatory's 64-metre telescope for reception of signals from the Apollo 11 spacecraft, particularly during the most critical phases of the mission when the LEM Eagle was on the lunar surface. The historic nature of the mission, combined with the fact that human lives were at risk in space, convinced Edward Taffy Bowen, the chief of the CSIRO's Radio Physics Division, and John Bolton to support the mission. Following high-level representations, cabinet-level meetings approved the Parkes Observatory involvement in the upcoming Apollo 11 mission. In February 1969, a meeting was convened with the Australian Department of Supply to arrange contract details. John Bolton had spent the previous evening with Robert Taylor, the American engineer who was to manage the NASA operations at Parkes. They had discussed their respective roles extensively and the problems to be overcome. John Bolton ended the meeting by insisting that he could work with Taylor and that he would only accept a one-line contract. The Radio Physics Division would agree to support the Apollo 11 mission. Financial return was to be $3,500 per day to cover costs at Parkes, plus $15,000 to cover additional work on the telescope. Further, in the documentary Background to the Apollo 11 Moonwalk television broadcast, released by Honeysuckle Creek, we are told,
the 64-metre dish of the Parkes radio telescope had been brought in as an auxiliary station to Honeysuckle. Parkes was capable of receiving but could not transmit to the spacecraft. The voice and telemetry received at Parkes was sent to Honeysuckle, where the best from the two stations was then sent on to Houston. Television from both Honeysuckle and Parkes was sent direct to Sydney, where NASA controller Charlie Goodman, seen at left, selected the best of the two for satellite transmission to Houston.
In other words, NASA used Parkes as a backup to their Honeysuckle Creek station. For further info on this, we go back to Parkes' site and we learn, since Parkes could only receive and not transmit, it was regarded as an auxiliary station to Honeysuckle Creek and was assigned the honorary designation of being station number 23 in the Manned Spaceflight Network. And just who owned the Manned Spaceflight Network? NASA, that's who!
Well, NASA has installed here at the Parkes radio telescope the specialized equipment to receive the unique signals from the Apollo 11 spacecraft. The signals consisting of TV from the lunar module landed on the moon's surface, the telemetry data vital to the maintenance and upkeep of the spacecraft, the biomedical data, a prime function of the life of the astronauts. The Manned Spaceflight Network consists of 22 stations, of which 18 are land stations, 4 are ships. Parkes has been given the honorary title of the 23rd tracking station in the Manned Spaceflight Network. As such, since Parkes has only a receive capability, it is considered an auxiliary antenna to the Honeysuckle Creek tracking station, and all of the telemetry, voice, and biomedical data is routed via microwave to the Honeysuckle Creek station, where it is interfaced with their computer and then routed to the Manned Spacecraft Control Center at Houston, Texas. Communications facilities here at Parkes consist of 2 telephone networks, commonly referred to as Net 7 and Net 1. Net 7 is an internal communication circuit between the Honeysuckle Creek tracking station, the Parkes radio telescope, and the Sydney Video Switching Center. The Net 1 circuit, which is monitor only at the Parkes telescope, carries the actual astronaut voice to Houston and also carries the voice from Houston to the astronauts. This monitor capability is required for voice synchronization for our television recording equipment. In addition to the 2 voice circuits, we have a standard telex or teletype circuit, which by dial-up only we can contact any of the 22 other tracking stations in the Manned Spaceflight Network, as well as the Goddard Space Center or the Spacecraft Center at Houston, Texas.
Clearly, whether owned by NASA or the CSIRO, Parkes was clearly directly working for NASA during the Apollo days. It was Station 23 of NASA's Manned Spaceflight Network. So much for being independent verification. That pretty much wraps up Webb's video. The video has not even been officially released yet, but clearly, the premise of the video is false. It is 1 part straw man and 6 parts fallacy of omission. It is most important to note that a lot of the things already addressed in this video were touched in my response to Phil Webb's introductory video response. I uploaded that video on May 9. and records show that Webb commented on that video on the very next day. The release date of his Parks video is May 21. Given the fact that he commented on it and added it to his favourites, he had to have watched the video. This means he uploaded his video knowing full well that its content is false. Phil Webb is outright lying to his audiences, and there are more videos on the way. Debunk Webb's Parks video. That's one job taken care of. Next. I look forward to picking apart the rest of Webb's videos. Maybe I should catch propagandists with their pants down more often.